Welcome to Democratic Television. I am your host, David Hayes, and I'm joined here with Angela Dennis. I'm editor and writer for Black with No Chaser in Knoxville Soul and program director of Shore Foundation in East Knoxville. And I'm here with Rick Held, the founding organizational member of Community Voices Coalition. And we're here to talk about Black poverty, and in a later segment, we'll be talking about Black prosperity. So, to give kind of a context about Black poverty and talk about the more natural and historical context of what's going on. I just kind of want to talk about a few different things and bring up a few different things from history. So if you look at inequality over the past 100 years, you'll see it is very high in the beginning of the century, and it's very high now. And we have a graph here that shows the inequality, so folks can see it. And so we have a graph that shows the inequality, the first figure. Yes, so you'll see it's very high at the beginning of the century, and it drops down around the 30s, and then it starts to come back up around the 80s. So the reason why inequality looks like that comes down to politics, comes down to political struggle and people and communities, right? So what happened in the 1930s? We of course had the Great Depression, but we also had a lot of activists and community organizers, and we had anarchists and socialists and labor unions and workers pressuring the government and pressuring the ruling class to get a whole range of demands and wins. So we got what we call the New Deal in the 30s. So in this New Deal, we had achievements such as Social Security, we had we had protections for labor and unions to organize, we got unemployment insurance, and we got welfare. And as we know, that wasn't accessible to all people in our country, especially Black people. But we see the struggle continued, and the strength of our movements continued to grow. And in the 60s, in the Great Society's legislations, we had medical insurance, and then we have civil rights wins, we have environmental wins, and we have wins for women's rights, right? So this is the context of why the inequality was kept at a lower rate, although some of us argue that even 5% inequality is not what our society should have. But nonetheless, this was the lowest inequality we had in our country's modern history. So why does it increase? What happens in that time period? So there's a few different things. Throughout that time period, our movements were strong. We got those wins in the civil rights movement, but we also internationally had a lot of wins. You see most of the continent of Africa being freed in the late 50s and then during the 60s. You see people in Latin America all over throwing back and fighting back against the colonial oppressors and forming their own governments with what's going on domestically. So there is a reaction to that. And not only that, we have an economic crisis. We have high levels of inflation and high levels of unemployment. And those are things that aren't supposed to happen. When you have high employment, you're not supposed to have high inflation because, you have high employment. That means people don't have the money to go out there and buy things, right? But that sort of basic principle was broken in that moment. So there was space for a new economic theory. And that's when we see neoliberalism come in, right? So under neoliberalism, and we talk about that as a set of economic arrangements between capital, the government, and labor, right? So what we see in this neoliberal age is a significant reduction in labor's ability to organize, right to work states, making it hard for unions to collect dues and to have memberships, right? We see a significant increase in capital's ability to move across borders. We have trade deals. We have companies closing down factories here just to set up a cheaper one overseas, right, with these trade deals. We have a significant reduction of government's ability to get taxes. Like in the city of Knoxville, we're not going to be able to get income tax for after next year, right? That ability has been taken away from us. And we see a significant reduction in the welfare state and significant increase in privatization and just the thought that businesses and profit-making institutions are better tools for society than government and economic and democracy. So in favor of more business principles instead of democracy, right? So if you look at the productivity versus average real earnings, and it's a graph I want to show you all. So if you look at what's going on here, you see productivity continues to rise through the 70s and through the 80s, right? But our wages remain the same. And that speaks to, that speaks to this kind of thought that we have that we always need to be hustling, we always need to be working, we always need to be producing. We need to feel bad about ourselves if we're not producing. All this contributes to like society where yes, we are producing so much, but we are getting less and less of the benefits from that, right? And and one dynamic within that is the decline in union membership, right? So the powers that be taking away the power from unions, and labor, that creates weaker, workers are weaker and not able to fight for their rights, and we see, we're seeing a decline among that. And we also, if you keep going, we see a decline in welfare benefits, right? So that's just making the conditions of our community worse and worse, and just continues to increase inequality. And again, as inequality continues to rise, so does our incarceration rates. If we look towards the 80s, we see a boom. Now we have private prisons, multi-million-dollar private prisons corporations profiting off of people in jail. So all this is happening at the rise of inequality, right? And so how does this inequality from neoliberalism, how does it affect our cities? Like I said before, cities can no longer collect the taxes that we need for our revenues. We no longer get the support from state and federal governments. And we are incentivized to do a lot more to attract downtown investment and economic activity at the expense of the rest of our cities and communities. And we also see an increased use of police. And in this increased use of police, we see two main functions, right? We see a source of revenue generation and a source of social control. And for the aspect of revenue generation, everybody knows what happened in Ferguson with Michael Brown and the uprising that happened. There was so much scrutiny on that police station, folks actually found out that 21% of the city's budget comes from the police. So that means that they are setting people up, that means they are trapping people, that means they are charging wild fines just to pay for the budget of the city, right? And that's a trend all across the country. So, and not only with the revenue generation, we also see the social control. So we look at what kind of society our governments are investing in, right? So we look at the Knoxville city's budget, and we look at police compared to the rest of the city and the rest of the city departments. We see police, when it comes to spending on its operations and its capital budgets, is far more than things like park and recreation, creating community space, after-school programs, activities for our youth, leadership opportunities, right? Community development, who has they distribute our affordable housing. Community organizations, social services like Community Action Coalition. So police is getting a lot more than all those things. And that is also an aspect of social control as far as how our cities are what kind of society our cities are trying to make. and that's put us in a situation of such high inequality. So one of the last things I want to mention about this turn to neoliberalism is the effect it's had on displacement of our communities. So we look at urban renewal in the 80s. Right, displacing so much of the black community. We look at gentrification now, displacing black community and poor and working class people all across downtown and across business areas. We look at the increase in incarceration and the significant increase in homelessness and people being kicked out of the homes and not having homes, right? So this all brings up to the situation of where we are now with inequality. It's as high as it's ever been, and the 1% owns as much land, wealth, stocks, and the politics and economic institutions they ever have. And just to talk about more of the political context, both parties are guilty of perpetuating this neoliberalism, but it is really the right wing who is really putting forth the most drastic form of it, in the form of discrimination and oppression, and really targeting poor communities and communities of color, and making sure we don't get the resources we need. So we see since 2008. We've had over 1,000 seats being taken over by the Republican Party. Right. We've had the Republican Party being taken over by the Tea Party and people like ALEC and corporate interest, right? To the point where they have taken over the most of the country when it comes to state legislators and governors. They either have all of them or just one of those, but they have power in our state governments. So they're really able to continue this drive towards neoliberalism, and really keep our communities in crisis. Right? So this is the national context, but what about Knoxville? What about black poverty in Knoxville? So just more on Knoxville, we got to understand the inequality is as high as it's ever been still. So we see Knoxville being number 3 in rising inequality in this study. This is number 3 behind Boston City and San Francisco. That's unacceptable, right? So Knoxville is in a highly unequal place, and it is black people who are getting really the rough end of the stick. So now we're going to phase into talking more about specifically black poverty in Knoxville. And I want to first introduce Rick Held, one of the founding members of the Community Voices Coalition. So we have some graphs here about Black poverty, and I want you to kind of help us understand some of these things. But also, I want you to talk about who you are, your organization, what y'all do, and just give us the context to your work.
Sure. So the the data that we're going to look at, we started digging into it. I was the community engagement director for a local nonprofit called SEED, which stands for Socially Equal Energy Efficient Development. And we started a project we called the Equity Campaign right about a year ago, as a matter of fact, the beginning of 2019. And one of the things, one of the early steps we took was to kind of we wanted to get a picture of what is the economic situation, we wanted to get a picture of where do we stand, where does Knoxville stand, where does our community stand in relation to how bad or good are we in terms of equality, inequality, poverty, that kind of thing. And so what we, and at the same time that we were hearing a lot of, the recruitment for the census. And so the first thing we were doing was like, well, what does the census say about poverty statistics? And so we started looking into what are the poverty rates in Knoxville, and we didn't know. One of the first things we found out was, it was pretty easy to just kind of do a couple clicks and find out that, for instance, Knoxville's overall poverty rate, which is at the last slide of these statistics, are the rankings, yeah, right there. And so it was pretty easy to see that, Knoxville's, for instance, their overall poverty rate was, I can't read that very well, 20-something%. Thank you.
27?
Yeah, 27% in 2018. But we didn't really know until we started digging in, what does that mean in relation to other cities of comparable size? And what we ultimately discovered when we dove in was that we looked at 30 cities in the Southeast with a population of 100,000 or more. And so based on that, so Knoxville's population, by the way, is 183,000 according to the latest census figures. And so what when we looked at all of these cities, what we found out was that was really surprising. Before I got into looking at this, I assumed that our poverty rate was somewhere in the middle, but it turns out we were pretty surprised that we were tied with Memphis in terms of poverty rates, and that's overall poverty rates. But really the most surprising factor we discovered was in terms of Black poverty, African American poverty, which was at 42%, and that turns out to be the highest poverty rate of any of these cities in the Southeast.
Wow.
And so, we're continuing to kind of dig down. As far as we can tell right now in terms of Black poverty, Knoxville has the worst poverty rate, and it's worse than it was 18 years ago by 2%. So it's going in the wrong direction, obviously, is one thing that we found out. So we know in terms of the roughly dozen states in the Southeast, we have the worst poverty rate, and we're starting to look to see where we stack up compared to the rest of the country, and we're still digging into that, but it's not looking great so far. One surprising thing to me, our Black poverty rate is worse than Baltimore, for instance, worse than St. Louis, for instance.
Yeah, and the stereotypes say that those places is way worse. A lot of folks wouldn't assume that at all.
Right, exactly. And so now we have to be careful. We're talking about percentage of the African American population that is in poverty. We're not talking about overall total numbers. Obviously, Memphis has more. It's probably 4 times the population of Knoxville. But so there are more poor African Americans, as a total number in Memphis, but as a percentage of the entire population, Knoxville's in a worse situation.
which is even more damning and a good distinction to make so folks are clear.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So that's where we're at with it right now, and so that was one of the getting that kind of data really kind of was the impetus for beginning to organize the Community Voices Coalition. And so what we did was, based on that information, we wanted to see, this is kind of top down, kind of high level kinds of data, but what we were really interested in was to find out, with that population that is in poverty, what are their ideas, what are their experiences of what that poverty means, what are the most important issues to folks in this community who are working with that poverty every day. And so that ultimately led, the second stage of the equity campaign was the Community Voices Survey, where we asked folks what their major concerns are. And so that kind of sets that up anyway.
Yeah, that's good to know. And I'm glad you talked about the work y'all are doing with the Community Voices Survey and Coalition. And now I want to pivot to Miss Angela Dennis, the world famous. You wrote an article that says poverty continues to be a death trap for Knoxville's Black residents.
Yes.
So just tell us why you wanted to write that article, why you feel it's important, and also talk about who you are, the things you do, and the publications you write for, and give us a picture into you.
So I had started writing for various outlets as a freelancer, and then I became the editor for a Black-owned media company called Black With No Chaser, which is a national Black media company. And so my idea was to start my own local publication called Knoxville Soul. And the idea around that was to kind of change and control the narrative when it comes to Black stories here. I kind of feel like our local media outlets are a little biased. I don't feel like they shed a lot of light on Black stories, inner city, what's happening, and just to control the narrative was my idea behind Knoxville Soul. When I wrote this article, I was kind of shocked by the fact that a lot of people in Knoxville, I believe, weren't aware of where we stand collectively with poverty. I think all of us know that for Black people, this isn't a place that's, thriving for us. But I wanted people to know where we stand collectively, and that 42% I noticed people were surprised by and shocked. So it almost seems like our people aren't even aware of where we are, as a whole. So yeah, I wanted to shed light on, where we stand so people are aware and can push our leadership in a direction where they know that we're demanding change. Right.
So kind of talk about the reaction you've gotten to that. Because like you said, this doesn't happen very much in local media.
I think the headline, what was it, Knoxville's?
Poverty continues to be a death trap for Knoxville's Black
yeah, the
residents.
headline was pretty striking, and it's to the point. So I think that alone got people's attention. The
and
reaction,
this, by the way, is in the mainstream. Daily
mainstream.
newspaper.
Yes, this is on Knox News.
Right,
Yes.
and that is my goal, is to create that striking attention to get people's attention in our mainstream media. So that's why I wanted to start guest writing for the Knoxville Sentinel. I do know that we don't see a lot of that in their daily news. So I feel like when I put that out, I got extreme reaction, probably more than I was expecting. But it was good, all positive. I think a lot of surprise, just people being surprised at where we stand.
Did you get any negative kind of challenge, pushback?
Did I get any negative? Not really. I try to stay away from reading the comments, especially on social media. We do have, this is a red state, and we do have, those Trump supporters, basically, that, every once in a while, of course, if I go online and read the comments, they will be on there kind of, but I didn't get much pushback from this article alone. I feel like Black people were surprised at where we stand, and I believe that white people were surprised at where we stand. That 42% number, ever since I wrote this article, I feel has stood out and we just keep talking about it. The 42%, the 42%. It's there.
And I think that was a moment in our community, right? Because we had a community organization doing the work to get this out, right? And building a grassroots momentum in this issue. You had different, not only the Community Voices Coalition, but also other community organizations talking about this. You had the political candidates having to talk about this, you know, and we have in our media space, you coming in and saying this is gonna hold space here. So I think that was a powerful moment, and maybe even why, you know, it's us talking up here today.
I would definitely strongly agree with you there. There was a pivotal political moment last year, and it had to do not only with what Community Voices was doing, but we held 2 mayoral candidate forums on these issues of poverty and related issues to poverty, gun violence, lack of youth opportunities, unaffordable utilities. And so there was a lot of interest in the community, and there was a lot of door knocking that was going on, right? Especially when we did the survey, which was like 700 people responded back to the survey, people in the inner city, about how they felt about these various issues. And so we turned these issues into election issues, right? They turned out to be like the major election issues, we thought. You know, before we had these candidate forums, the hot button issues were like scooters downtown, right? and whether you know, stuff like that, and you know, now and then suddenly it was like, you know, and then recode was another big hot issue, right? And so, but that was kind of, it was really interesting to find out that when you talked about neighborhood walkability, that has a completely different meaning. Say in outside of the inner city, right? That's about sidewalks, repairing sidewalks. Whereas neighborhood walkability, we know in the inner city is about whether you can walk down your neighborhood without getting shot at, right? And so that got lifted up, and so as it turned out, the voter turnout in these inner city precincts has historically been notoriously low before this mayoral election. But what we found out, went back and looked at the voter turnout in these inner city precincts for this mayoral election, it was triple at least of what the turnout was in any other mayoral election, at least in the last 30 or 40 years. So something's going on. There's some kind of movement happening, some kind of buzz.
Definitely. And I like to think that we're part of it.
Right.
You know,
I'm sure we are.
Definitely continue making sure it continues and grows and builds.
I think the timing with the article and what Community Voices was doing, and then, you know, during your campaign kind of just woke everyone up.
Oh yeah, there was your campaign.
Yeah, that little thing. Yeah, and it was interesting going from the beginning of the campaign trail where, you know, it was talking about scooters, things like that, you know.
I remember that.
And then towards the end, it's like, no, you have to talk about poverty and the effects of poverty.
And it started coming up at all the forums, right? Yeah.
Couldn't avoid it. Being on interviews for, you know, local news and then leading with questions like this. So, yes, we're definitely at a good moment with building awareness, and that makes me optimistic that we can actually do some things to change some things. But I wanted to show y'all some more of the data that y'all obtained about some of the top issues that residents selected, and I think it's interesting. Not only the top issues that came up, which is you would expect, kind of as you would expect, like gun violence, lack of youth opportunities, unaffordable utilities, shortage of living wages, jobs, you know, inadequate K-12 education, unaffordable housing. Those are the top ones, right? And I'm sure many of us weren't that surprised by seeing those. It was good to like see that participation, you know, and it was good because it drove the political conversation in helpful ways. But I think there is an interesting dynamic when you look at the gender makeup of it. You know, when you look at, you know, when it comes to women, what's their highest priorities? It comes to home health quality, child safety, unaffordable utilities, and then barely like gun violence is a majority. You know, when you look at the men, it's in the opposite. You have race relations and police and community relations at the top concerns, and then gun violence, and you have home health quality at the very bottom. You know, so I just want to see like kind of like what y'all's take on not only how poverty is affecting people, but like when it comes to gender, when it comes to like how it's affecting like men and women in different experiences. What are y'all takes?
As far as I'm not really aware of the gender differences. This is kind of new to me. One thing I think with the Community Voices survey, seeing the youth opportunities and gun violence and affordable,
Utilities and
housing, those issues being most important to inner city residents, and then the 42% poverty rate. I noticed that people outside of the inner city, in other areas of Knoxville, it seems that their concerns are completely different from where the inner city stands. It's almost like we're living in two different spectrums, two different cities. It's like the east, when you get east of downtown, it's just it's like we're living in another world. Black people are, it's Black Knoxville, just like they say Black America. That's just what I've seen. It's like west and east, and it's just two totally different situations.
Definitely. Did you have any takes?
Well, it's in terms of the differences. It's not surprising to me. The experiences are different with different genders. But I'm hoping that we can dig deeper with this. I mean, to my knowledge, it's the first time a project like this has been undertaken at this kind of scale. I mean, nobody's, as far as I can tell, has ever bothered to ask these kinds of questions of this population before now, right? And it's a pretty significant sample size. And what I would be interested to find out whether, if we were to do the same survey today, whether the results would be the same or not, right? In fact, so I should say that gun violence was overwhelmingly, by a huge margin, the most significant concern of folks in the inner city. But I suspect so. This survey was completed last spring, and then, of course, we remember in the fall when we had a police shooting. And it got a lot of attention. I suspect if we would have taken the same survey then, that police community relations would have been bumped up.
I wonder also, like, if they took the survey today, if perhaps even poverty, where we stand economically, would be, one of the top issues for inner city residents.
Well, to me, all of these are about poverty, right?
Right, they are.
These are all poverty issues. It's kind of getting down into the nitty-gritty about, kind of opening that whole can up.
But I do see what y'all are saying, because it's one thing to have the understanding of all these things are wrong, but it's also another thing to understand that it's people in our communities who don't have the wealth. There's money out there.
And all of these issues are a result of poverty.
Yes, exactly. And that's one of the things, going back to the budget, it's these things that our city should be invested in solving. And that actually creates a better environment for the rest of the city. You solve Black poverty, Knoxville's thriving.
Yep.
Exactly.
All of Knoxville.
So,
exactly.
Thank y'all for joining us for this segment of the show, and thank you for joining us in this segment of Democratic Television.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Democratic Television. I'm your host again, David Hayes, and right now I'm joined with Amelia Parker, the City Council at-large Seat C representative.
Yes.
And in the first section, we just got done talking about Black poverty, the high Black poverty rate in Knoxville, and talking about inequality in Knoxville and across the nation. But now we want to pivot to talking about prosperity. You know, it's always doom and gloom in talking about our community, it would seem, but hardly ever talk about the ways that the opportunities ahead of us and what that could look like. So I want to start off talking about what Black prosperity can look like in Knoxville, but more specifically, just because there's a lot of conversation about equity coming from everywhere, coming from the city, coming from community groups, So I want to also talk about how does equity come into play when we talk about Black poverty or Black prosperity, and if folks don't know what equity means, if you could explain that.
I think I'm glad that you're hosting this show and encouraging these conversations, because it's an important conversation to have. And it's happening at a time where I am hopeful of, the possibilities moving forward, especially around the issues of equity and inclusion in our city. Um, so when talking about equity, I think it's important that we clarify that equity is not equality. A lot of folks, when they hear equity or think about equity, um, I hear, the word equal, follow soon afterwards. And how do we, create equal outcomes throughout the community? But really, to achieve equity, what we are called to do in the city government is ensure that we're investing the resources necessary, to bring parts of our community, parts of our city up to a level where they're essentially on the same playing field with everyone else. And so equity often calls us to invest more in areas that have been underinvested in, rather than think about how we can invest equally in those areas, because we got a little bit more work to do to bring them up.
So that's good. So it's understanding the inequalities that already exist, and understanding that you got to give to people with more inequality more than the people who are less unequal.
And when we're looking at local government, oftentimes also folks are limited in their thinking of just government contracts, and thinking about how is the city contracting, who is the city contracting with, and how can we address disparities in that area. That's extremely important. But to achieve racial equity, we've got to look at city functions, the city budget, across departments, in every way that we are engaging the community as a city. It needs to be evaluated to ensure that we are implementing programs, adopting budgets that are going to move us towards those equitable outcomes. Sorry, excuse me.
That's all right. So, don't threaten. If I put myself in a situation of the city, in more establishment politics, because the response is, well, disparities ultimately it's on the people who are in disparity. Like the reason why black people don't have contracts is because black people are unable to.
Right.
The reason why people are poor and homeless is because it's their personal actions that led to that, right? So like that's that's a lot of what we continue to hear. But as we know, that's not the case. But like, can you dive into more like how looking at disparities and going at them from an equitable way is different from just putting the blame completely and putting the onus and responsibility completely on the people experiencing that disparity?
Well, and that's a perfect place to start, because if you are approaching the work of equity and you don't have a good definition and you don't have a good understanding of the problem, then you may implement solutions that can actually further, essentially racist ideology. Because, there are so many studies out there. And we went through this recently with the Knox County School Board, when there was discussion of how to address the disparities in Knox County schools, when looking at discipline, looking at student achievement along lines of race and ability. And, some of the research that I wanted to share with the school board, showed how when a disparity exists, and especially if that disparity has existed over decades, that is a structural systemic issue, and it's not because of the bad behavior of little black children, that they're being suspended at a much higher rate than their white counterparts. And so for those working in the government, those who are developing programs, looking for solutions and developing budgets, you have to start from a place that acknowledges that when you have a disparity and a long-held disparity in place, we cannot put that blame on the community we have to look at structurally what has led to this disparity. And then, of course, the solution, oftentimes, we've got to make sure that we're empowering that community to define the solutions to that problem. So they're going to be a part of the solution, but they should not be blamed as causing the problem.
Yes, thank you, appreciate that.
Yeah.
So, and bringing it back more intentionally to, Black prosperity, right? Black folks living our best lives, right?
Yes.
Now, when we think about the sort of development that happens in the city, one of the things I talked about in the previous segment is about the rise of neoliberal politics and how there's been a rise in concentration in investing in downtown investment and development, right?
Yeah.
So we're seeing a very, and we're continuing to see more inequality growing. We continue to see more inequality when it comes to where is being developed, where isn't, where is wealth being created, and who has access to space and who doesn't. When we talk about Knoxville, we have a history, obviously, of like intense downtown development, and we're seeing gentrification. So in this time right now, it's 2020, how can our development, be actually encouraging Black prosperity instead of threatening it?
Good question. If we continue doing the same thing that's been done, we'll continue to see the same outcomes. And I will have to say, I'm talking to our new mayoral administration to get a sense of how they're going to approach these issues of inclusion and equity. And one concern I have is the organizational chart for the mayor's office has recently been released, and we still have a downtown coordinator under community development. It's not under, community relations, or it's not under trash pickup and parks and rec, or it's under community development, community and economic development. So there's still a focus, it seems, in the new administration on downtown. And what we've seen, because of that focus, are other areas of town that have gone without the investment needed. And in fact, other areas of town that have had investment directed towards them that was then redirected to one of these projects. One recently that I learned about, and I have to look into it more, are the traffic and congestion around Easttown Mall. That has to be a priority. The economic development of that area has to be a priority for the city. And I learned recently that there was money dedicated to that area to fix some of that traffic congestion leading up to Murphy Road, and that was diverted over to Cumberland Avenue. That's a concern. We have multiple projects that have been proposed in East Knoxville, an area that's needed investment for way too long now. Burlington, where we had a thriving Black business district that needs to be rebuilt, and that's going to take significant investments. There are a lot of projects coming up, and we're going to have to make decisions about what to prioritize. And so I'm concerned to see downtown still have such prominence when we know other areas of the city are desperately in need in that investment. And that investment, public infrastructure, business development, et cetera, that the city can do that's going to address poverty rates in our city, throughout our city, but particularly that 42% poverty rate in the Black community, and just general public infrastructure upgrades that have been needed, for a community to be healthy and to thrive. And so I hope that the appearance of that position continuing is not as concerning as it is right now to me. I have more to learn. I have some questions to ask. But we've got to make a shift as a city to prioritizing other parts of town that haven't had that investment, and making sure that we're directly, investing in areas that are going to address the high poverty rates in parts of our community.
Now, quickly, I want to ask you kind of a little curveball.
Yeah.
So you work for an international organization.
Okay.
Right?
Yes.
I know it's a different world, but you work for an international organization, and you
Yes.
work with black people, not only black people, but black people all across the world.
Yeah.
You know, understand this fight against black poverty, this fight for prosperity has been a generational fight.
Yeah.
You know, we can all say a struggle goes back to the same place. It comes
Yeah.
back to the, colonialism, right? So I'm just wondering, when you're doing the solidarity work, you can elaborate on that a little bit more, but, are you getting any faith for what other, our communities and families do in other places? Does that give you any hope or faith for what we're doing here?
Yes, absolutely. And one thing, I'll say it really quickly because I know we're short on time. Another reason I wanted to engage in local politics here in Knoxville is because I see too many similarities with what strategies we're pursuing here in Knoxville and what I see being done in Honduras and Colombia and other places, and they're having negative impacts on black and indigenous populations in those communities. And that is, we're creating programs. One example is the Homemakers Program. I've talked to folks who benefited from the Homemakers Program, who learned about it living outside of the state and decided to move to Knoxville and have bought multiple properties through the Homemakers Program. And so those are strategies that are being used in, Honduras and Colombia, where the land is cheap. The government has opened that land up to investors to come from outside of the area to invest, and oftentimes that can lead to conflicts between these new investors who are coming in and the local community that's been there for generations. And so these are things that we have to think about when we're designing our programs. Are we just attempting to get more property back on the tax rolls? Are we implementing projects that are going to further, the economic well-being, the community health of our neighborhoods and the residents that are here in Knoxville? So that's some of the things that I've learned, seeing similarities from my work with Peace Brigades International on the international level, and here in Knoxville, and some lessons that I hope to bring forward that we can learn from.
Thanks for that blessing. I love
Yes.
that. Good. Well, appreciate you being here, and we appreciate other people watching this, and we hope that people will join the movement to get these things started and to make sure that we have a Knoxville that works for all of us. So, again, my name is David Hayes. This is Amelia Parker, and thanks for watching.
I don't think they got that last.